Hi, everybody. Uh, I'm Nick Marks, CEO of Friday, and as you can see here, here's Sharon Grossman, or I should say Dr. Sharon Grossman, or Burnout Doc, or whatever you like to be called. I'm just what we're going to talk about today is can team happiness be an antidote to burnout? And I'm most certainly not an expert on burnout, though probably like most of us, I've been close to it sometimes in my career. I'm not sure, I don't think I've had full burnout, to be honest. But Sharon is here to talk to and explain to us about burnout. I'm going to ask her questions and she's going to ask me questions. So it's going to be very light. I don't think there are any slides, actually. Are you using any slides, Sharon?
Nope.
Nope. Okay, so I'm not either. My colleague Angela is online, so she will manage the chat and the Q&A. And just before we start, Sharon, you don't know I'm going to do this, but we've got a poll. Do you want to put that up, Angela, about basically just, of those of us that are here, what's our, have we ever experienced burnout? And I think I've given you 3 options. Are you good with that, Angela, to put that up? There it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going up now.
Thank you. So have you ever experienced it? So yes, maybe, or perhaps whatever, or no. And if you could answer that now, we just have a little baseline, Sharon. I don't know whether you've ever done that and asked people immediately whether they have. Have you done that before?
I haven't, but usually when people get on a call with me, it's because they have. So
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. Well, it's proved very popular, amongst our client base and other people that know about us as a webinar. So I think all of us are interested in this topic and what you've got to say. I must admit now, Angela, I'm not quite sure we do the results. Can you put them up? Are they done?
If I end the poll, I think
Yeah.
I can share the results.
Okay, so no is very small, and 60% feel they've have experienced burnout, and 30%, that's where I'd have put maybe in my thing. So there you are, Sharon. A lot of people on here who have had a very personal experience of burnout. So perhaps you could just start off by, as the Burnout Doc, that's what you like to call yourself, isn't it? Or yeah, Dr.
Yeah.
Burnout. You call it the Burnout Doc. Yeah. What is burnout? Yeah. And just maybe say a little bit about yourself first. Yeah.
Sure. So thanks for the introduction. So my name is Dr. Sharon Grossman, and I am a psychologist turned coach, and I really specialize in burnout. And that's how I spend really a lot of my day, right? I've written a book on it. I write blog articles on it every week. I have a podcast that I interview guests on. So this is really my jam. And I'm so glad to be here to be able to really help you guys, whether you're in that camp where you're like, I'm not sure, was that burnout? I'm in that maybe category, figure out what it is. Or if you have burned out, how to avoid it from happening, what got you there in the first place. And those few of you who are in the no category, I would say, to perhaps prevent it from really happening. So I'm glad you're all here. And I like to simplify things. It's one of my superpowers. So just when we're talking about burnout, I like to think about it as chronic stress. And that's to be differentiated from what we experience or what we talk about when we say, I'm really stressed out. And it's usually something that's happening in that moment. So as an example, if you had an altercation with someone, or you were stuck in traffic, or, you're coming up on a deadline, there are things that are temporarily stressful for us. And we experience these day in and day out. However, it's when we are up against stress all the time that it becomes chronic. So I like to think about it as like an onion where we've got this layer upon layer upon layer. And so we're building this, if you will, stress onion. And that is the chronic nature of the stress that becomes burnout. And when we experience acute stress, we can typically recover from it pretty quickly. when stress is chronic, whether it's because it's the same thing day in and day out, and there's those layers building, or that we just have stressors coming in from all different angles. We have it from our work, we have it from our health, we have it from our families and friends, and just all kinds of things that are happening from the environment. That can also turn into this stew of, stress, and that can be burnout. And so when we experience burnout, we know that it's a little bit different from how we normally experience stress that's acute because of the symptoms that we're seeing around burnout. So, for those of you who are in that category of yes, that you have experienced it, I bet if we interviewed each one of you separately, you would each have a different story of your burnout, of how it manifested for you. And that's actually something to note about burnout, is that it's not this one size fits all, whether it's in terms of why it shows up, how it shows up, or what it requires of you to recover from it. So that's part of why we put this webinar together, to really dispel a lot of these myths and to help inform a lot of you about what to look out for, what to think about, what to do different in order to really be able to be on, where Nick and his team are focused, which is happiness at work.
Yeah. I like the idea of the many-layered onion and the things, and also the fact that it's not the same for all of us. And one of my questions to you was like, what's the difference between burnout and just like perpetual unhappiness at work? What do you think? That how would you?
That's a really interesting question, and I would say that it might be that perpetual unhappiness at work that leads to burnout, right? Because if we think about what is happiness or what is stress, a lot of it is really about perception. And maybe you can talk about the things that or the ways in which we perceive our reality that contribute to happiness. But what I can tell you is, when it comes to stress, is it's not necessarily the stressor itself, but it's our perception of that stressor. So you can have two people on your team that are up against the exact same deadline, or that they're both dealing with the same situation. And one of them is going to be really motivated and really focused, and they're going to be like, all right, we're going to get this done. And the other person is falling apart, and they're like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And this is too much, and I'm overwhelmed. And they become frazzled, and they're not able to pull it together. So it's the exact same deadline, perhaps, but it's the way that we think about it that is either going to allow us to get the work done and be on task, or become unraveled by it and feel really stressed out by it.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. So I was thinking about this because I know I've got to ask you questions, and so I was starting to think about it. And I don't know if you know the work of Daniel Kahneman and the difference between the experiencing and the remembering self. And in fact, Angela might pop a reference to this in the chat, but what Kahneman talks about, so Kahneman, most of you will know him, and he's a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. He's one of the great brains of this century, really. And he talks about the fact that when we experience things in our experience, an experience only lasts a moment, and but what we're left with is the memory, and the remembering self is the one that makes the decision. So the experiencing self sort of goes through life experiencing moments, but we lay down memories in different bits. And this has all sorts of not necessarily perversions or biases, but things happen. So there's something called the peak end experience, which is that if you're listening to a piece of music, it's beautiful, and then there's a bum note at the end, you basically think the whole piece was rubbish. Well, actually, you've experienced 99% of it, and it's only the last note, but we put a lot of emphasis on the end. And I've got this hypothesis, really, that one of the problems when we get burnt out is when we are not listening to the experiencing self enough. So the experiencing self is really stressed. And the problem might be that the remembering or narrative self is telling us, I'm a person that can cope. I'm a strong person. I can deal with this stress. So maybe the person who's actually thinking they're okay, sometimes that tends to be the one that gets burnt out. I don't know. It feels like to me burnout sometimes sneaks up on us, that we just suddenly collapse. I think it's because we're telling ourselves a positive message about ourselves, or we really love our job, so we should carry on, whereas the person maybe who doesn't cope earlier doesn't get burnt out because they deal with it. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis. And I would say, people burn out for so many different reasons. I haven't necessarily come across this scenario, but I think it's not just how negative or positive it is that we think about things, but it's also the way that we cope with things. And obviously a lot of that is connected, because if I believe that I can cope with something, I am more likely to then be proactive and look for solutions. And I have faith in myself. That's a huge thing, right? That's a lot of where I spend time with my clients working, because a lot of times there is that imposter syndrome, where there is that anxiety about the future. There's a lot of things that get in the way of us really showing up in the best form. And so I think there is a little bit of a connection between the way we interpret our current situations and the way that we then move forward with them, and whether that kind of throws us off track or not. But to your point, like, you're talking about people who are maybe overly optimistic, and then they're coming up against reality and they're like, oh, like maybe I was wrong. And all of a sudden, you can have some doubt creep in. And so I would say the point isn't to be this Pollyanna-ish, version of yourself. We want to be realistic. And yeah, I mean, if you, in any parts of life, if you are being unrealistic, you're probably going to come across some really big challenges that are going to throw you off, and then it's going to mess with your mind, right? Because here you are trying to be all like positive about it, but then if you experience this reality that doesn't align, then you start to doubt, well, maybe I got it all wrong, or maybe I can't do this, or, and you start going into the maybe land, where you're questioning everything. I think it's best to have a more realistic view of what's possible and maintain that positivity as much as you can, which means that if you do just that, it's huge, because a lot of what leads people to experience that inner stress is the negative self-talk, the self-doubt, the lack of trust, the criticisms that they're constantly berating themselves every time they make a mistake, they get something wrong. That's a huge thing. If you can remove that negativity piece, that's like, I would say, a third of the way there.
Yeah. I have, just to my embarrassment, realized I've just described my near personal experience of burnout and then tried to wrap it up in Daniel Kahneman's intelligent words, because I think I'm exactly that person who goes along being very positive and then doesn't. And I sometimes override the sort of negative, stressful feedback. And I sort of think, I'll cope. And then, of course, it, as you said, sometimes it just suddenly hits you, or you start having symptoms. I mean, one of my observations is that other people noticed I was getting burnt out before I did. Is that something you find that's common?
It's very common. And that's actually a big reason why I have made it my mission to go out there and talk about this and educate the public, because we don't really understand this enough until we go through it. So like, now that you're on the other side of it, right? Imagine like you're burning out, you don't recognize it. Other people are recognizing it. And then you have that moment of like, yeah, I got it. Now I see what's actually what all these people have been talking about, that I was like, well, you're crazy. Now it's like, oh, that's what they were talking about. Now I have a word for it, right? That whole process. Now, if it were to happen again, you would probably be more mindful of it. You'd be more aware that you're going through it because you've had that experience. But until we have that experience, we really don't know. It's just a word.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, and this is what I found, is when I started doing a lot of the research on burnout for my book, and I got really into this area, I was listening for it. So when my clients would come and they start talking to me about their lives and all these things that are going on, I would say to them, it sounds like you're burning out. And they would have to like take a step back and say, Oh, that's what's happening, right? It was almost like they didn't have the word, but when they had the word, it all came together for them. And I think that's important. You know,
Yeah.
as a psychologist, I really believe in diagnosing the problem only so that we can have a tailored solution, right? A treatment that aligns with that diagnosis. If we don't know that we're burning out, we might try all kinds of things. And we see this all the time. People aren't sleeping. So they're like, oh, maybe I'll get a better mattress, or I'll get those blackout shades, or I'll take a sleeping pill or something, right? And it's like, well, maybe you're not sleeping because your mind can't turn work off and you have a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. And maybe what you really need to do is focus on de-stressing and relaxation, right? So sometimes we target the wrong solutions because we just don't have the right diagnosis for the problem.
Yeah. And as you say, people's burnout can be different, and presumably it can be different grades of burnout from,
Yeah.
So yeah, so the people that come and see you, I mean, would you say some of them are mildly burnt out and some are fully, and how do you sort of think about the difference between that? I mean, obviously it's bad for them if they come to see you, full stop,
Yeah. So burnout is on a spectrum. So I would say I call it the stress burnout spectrum. So you can be stressed, right? And you have like on one end of the spectrum, acute stress, and then that stress becomes more chronic. And then you get into maybe a more mild version of burnout, and then a more moderate version, and then a severe version. And obviously the less burned out you are, the lower you are on that scale, the better for you in terms of how quickly you're going to recover. It's when you are in that more moderate or severe range that it just probably takes longer because there's more stuff to recover from. And there's different, I also look at not just like how severe it is, but also what are the things that you're contending with. So if a lot of it is mindset, that's one thing, but it could also be like some environmental stressors that you want to look at. It might be that there's some habits in place that need to be shifted around. There could be trauma on board. There could be so many different things that we want to look for. So I'm really more interested not in necessarily how severe it is. I mean, the only thing with that I would say is people who are on the very, very severe end of things, those are the people that really probably would benefit from therapy, because a lot of times what we see is people become suicidal because they're so depressed at that point. And that's where they need more of a psychological intervention. And what I'm offering is really work around the mindset and the optimization with time management and with your working on that relationship with yourself. So that's more coaching. And I think that's more appropriate for people who aren't at risk, they're not, their life's not in danger, if I may say that.
Yeah. So thinking to workplaces and teams, how do we help a colleague we think is starting to get burnt out? How do we frame things in a way that they can listen to and they don't just push it away, or be respectful to them, that it's not like a weakness on their side? I guess some people must take it as a weakness or something.
100%. I think there's so many factors that make it challenging to answer this question as like, you just do this, right? Because it depends on the person. Some people actually do view this as very stigmatizing, and that's very cultural. So some people feel like they have to just weather the storm, and they have to have this facade of like, I got everything together, and they can't share when they're struggling, and they can't show that there's something going on with them. So those are the people that are actually at greater risk because they're not getting the social support. They're not getting the resources that they might be able to utilize to help them. And so it's going to be more challenging with those folks. And I think the best thing you can do if you are a team leader and you have somebody like that on your team is to be vulnerable first. Because when we are vulnerable ourselves, it invites vulnerability on the other side. in almost every culture, we view vulnerability as a weakness, right? And we have this fear of being seen as weak. But when I have clients like that, I often send them videos of people sharing their story and being really vulnerable, especially like on stage in front of a crowd. And I'll ask them, what was your impression of this person? And usually the perception is this person was very courageous. You know, there's admiration for people who are putting themselves out there because we know how hard it is, because we have a fear of doing that ourselves. So when we see that modeled, it gives us permission to do it ourselves, also because we see that there's this disconnect between how we think people will perceive us for being vulnerable versus how we see other people who are being vulnerable. And when we see that that's admirable, then it can be like, oh, okay, like maybe other people can view me like that instead of it being like a weakness or something that's wrong with me, right? I think we just have to embrace that humanity piece of this is something that we're all dealing with. There's nothing wrong about it. And one of the things I like to share is statistics, you know, and when it comes to burnout, if you're burned out, you are absolutely not in the minority camp. In fact, some studies have shown that as many as 77% of workers are burned out at any one time. And so if you can imagine yourself being in a room with 3 other people and you're not burned out, there's a chance the other 3 are.
You know,
and you're the exception.
I've seen statistics like that, and I get very skeptical of them because I know from my surveys, when I do population surveys about happiness, right? Yeah. You've probably got 60 to 70% of people saying they're happy at work. And so, and of course, I do think that stress and happiness can coexist, and pressure certainly can do. But it might be it's a focusing thing that when we ask people in surveys to pay attention to the question we're asking them, they're more likely to agree with it than, you know, to think about it. But I'm not saying the statistic is wrong. I'm just saying that it's interesting. And I kind of was actually thinking about that. If I go back to me trying to make a clever point, which maybe not have been clever with the Kahneman thing, was that, you know, often when we ask people how happy you are with your work overall, they go on and they're remembering self and they think about the overall job and whatever. And when we ask them about the stress, they go straight to their experience now. And I don't know whether people sometimes in surveys get stress and burnout mixed up, you know, as in, you know, and do people commonly use the word almost too lightly for what they've got? I don't know, but my hunch would be there might be something like that going on.
Well, I think, you know, we started out by surveying people, and I think what would be a good way to test it is maybe explain what burnout is.
Yeah.
And then ask people, like, does that definition fit for you? Right? Do you feel like you've experienced that version of what we call burnout? And then I think you have a little bit more control over that piece of like, we're all on the same page here. We're all talking about the same thing. Right. And then we're not taking it lightly. And we might say, like, and if you have, like, what does taking it lightly actually look like? Right. And maybe we can define that.
Yeah.
But as we said, burnout can be anywhere on that spectrum. And so it's really a very personal judgment. I think I kind of take it, if you feel burned out, that's good enough for me. Right. Like, I'm not going to say like, oh, it's not really enough. Right. Like, you don't really need help. I feel like if you're using that word, there's probably a good reason for it. And now it's really about digging for what's going on and how can we help you?
I mean, I think definitely if you're using that word, something suboptimal is going on. That seems to be absolutely certain. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you were to give like the sort of 5 symptoms you can see in somebody who's getting burnt out, what would they be? It doesn't have to be precisely 5, but a few symptoms. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, Christina Maslach is the researcher who is kind of spearheaded all the research on burnout. She spends a lot of time working in organizations. And so what I'm going to say here is that her 3 flagship symptoms that she talks about.
What was her name again?
Christina Maslach.
Okay. Yeah.
She's out of Berkeley. And so and this is, if you Google burnout, you'll find these 3 symptoms kind of stand out. So it starts with exhaustion, and that exhaustion is more of a mental, emotional kind of exhaustion as opposed to a physical exhaustion. And that makes sense if we think about our situation at work, where we are asked to sit in front of a desk or sit at a desk and look at a computer screen often and focus on that screen, or focus on writing a report. There's something that requires our mind to really hone in. And so what we all know, that when we're tired, if we haven't gotten a good night's sleep, if we're sick, if there's a lot on our mind, it's hard for us to do that. And what we see with burnout is we get more of that brain fog that makes it difficult for us to focus. And so that mental, emotional exhaustion can come as a result of the burnout, but that's kind of how that's kind of like a red flag. If you're noticing that you're like, hey, I used to be able to focus. Now it's so hard. What's going on? That's a sign. Another sign is what's happening with your attitude. And we see a lot of people becoming more cynical, becoming more irritable, becoming more resentful. Those are really big things in terms of how we feel about being at work, right? And to illustrate the point, I was once working with a veterinarian, and she was convinced at the beginning of this journey with me that the reason for her burnout was because of her industry. It had nothing to do with her, right? So here she is putting in all these hours. She had a shift from a certain hour to a certain hour, and she would always come in like an hour early and stay at least an hour late. And so she was working overtime and not getting paid for it. And she was just saying, like, it was just impossible to get the work done that she needed to get done in the time frame that she had. As we started doing the work, it came out that she was really a perfectionist, and she was taking on more than she really needed to in that time frame. And so it really was the fact that she put these additional demands on herself. And by being able to focus herself more, right? Because I put her up to this challenge. I asked her, how many shifts do you have between now and the next session, that we're going to meet? And she said 3. I said, okay, let's create the 3-shift challenge. And your job is to go to work on time and leave on time for the next 3 shifts. And never been done before. And I said, and then I want you to email me. And she sent me this email, and she said, I just finished my 3rd shift and I was able to meet this challenge head on, right? She was able to get there on time and leave on time. And then she described how she did it. And it was like, okay, so when I noticed that my mind wanted to move and I wanted to like check my WhatsApp or go on Facebook, I said no. And when I wanted to do these extra things, which is what she was typically doing, right? She would meet with a patient, they would ask her something, she didn't know the answer, and she said, let me research it and I'll get back to you. And so this would create additional work for her that really wasn't necessary for that day. And I said to her, why don't you invite them back for a follow-up, go over that information with them. At least you can bill for that time, as opposed to working double for the same amount. And so she started doing all these things and asking herself, is this essential for today, for me to get through my day? And she was able to weed out a lot of things. But when we're in that burnout state, a lot of times we're not doing that. We're not thinking strategically. We're not weeding things out. And we become distracted and we can't focus. So exhaustion's a big thing. The attitude's a big thing. And then our productivity goes down, and it affects also how we view ourselves. So if you are the kind of person who used to be able to accomplish tons and your productivity was sky high, and now you're not able to, and your productivity is suffering, it affects your view of yourself. Like you start to think, maybe there's something wrong with me. Right. And we get into more of the anxiety and the imposter syndrome and worrying about what's actually happening. Like I don't know what it is. Often we don't have the word for it. But so those are just some flagship kind of signs that Christina shares in her research.
So basically you're saying 3 things, which were exhaustion, particularly sort of a mental and emotional.
Yeah.
Attitude, which sort of being irritable sort of thing, and then productivity going down.
Yeah.
So people listening, I'm going to open this up for you to have some questions for Sharon in a minute, but just think about those three things and your burnout thing. You know, was it about that level of exhaustion? Did you get irritable? Did your productivity fall, you know, in it? So do write questions in the Q&A, and Angela is going to mediate those. But before we do that, I think Sharon was going to ask me some questions about whether I felt that happiness is an antidote to things. So we're gonna switch roles now a bit.
Excellent. Yeah. So we just talked about all things burnout, and now we really want to get a sense of how do you get from 0 to 10 when it comes to your work? You know, especially if you're unhappy at work and you want to get to that place where I'm like off the charts, I'm so happy, like, and I do want to just insert a little caveat here, because sometimes people have this idea that if they're burned out, it means that they are miserable at work, and that's actually not true. So you brought this up earlier. I think that people can be absolutely in love with their work, which is why they work as much as they do. And it really feeds them. So you could be totally happy, but also burned out. So we're not talking about that, but we're saying like, you're miserable. You really don't like your life, right? You're not happy at work. How do you go from that, Nick, to being like really satisfied, really happy at work?
Yeah. So one of the things, obviously, is about burnout is it resides in the individual. The individual is experiencing it. And one of the things I think very much about happiness at work is it's very much between us, that it's a lot about how we interact with other people at work. That, you know, we're very social creatures, and how we get on with our team, our colleagues, is very, very important to our happiness and well-being at work. And of course, that I would think is also an antidote to burnout if you've got support and you've got good relationships. So when we're at Friday Pulse talking about what the 5 ways to happiness at work are, so the first one is connect. It's about our relationships, and with our colleagues, with other teams, where we've got friends at work. And friends at work are, you know, they can be a colleague, but they can be someone outside of your team, but someone you can go and have a laugh with, a talk, let off steam with. You know, that's a really important thing. So first it is connect. The second one is be fair. And I'm going to come back to fairness, because I think fairness is actually what undermines happiness and also leads to burnout, is unfairness. That I'm going to come back to. So the third one is empowerment, which is about autonomy, really about being able to shape your work. You know, it's horrible being micromanaged. You know, it's about playing to your strengths, so doing work that you enjoy. I mean, it gets pretty miserable if you're doing work. You know, sometimes we've got these skills that we're good at, but we don't enjoy. So the difference between a strength and a skill is a strength you feel energized when you're doing it. A skill you can do and you're competent at it, but a strength that gives you energy. And quite often people can get caught in jobs that they're good at. It's not their love. And I think it's important to try and get those two aligned as much as possible. The fourth one is to be challenged, which is about the right and appropriate amount of challenge. And of course, this can lead to burnout when it goes too far, you know, but if you're not challenged enough, you're bored, you know, and boredom's like a real joy killer at work. It is stressful in its own way, but the advantage with boredom is you've got time to think about other things, and you might go and apply for another job. Often when you're really stressed the other way, you actually haven't got any time. So the idea of looking for another job or something just can't even enter the equation because you haven't got time. Whereas at least if you're bored, you've got time. And actually that comes out in retention figures, that bored people are almost twice as likely to leave a job as stressed people, because they kind of, they've got the motivation and the time. And then the fifth one is inspire, which is really meaning and purpose and whatever, but it's like, is your job worthwhile? You know, do you get a sense of accomplishment? You know, so that sort of stuff is often the sort of the thing that really, you know, helps us reach for things. And of course, again, you can see scenarios where people feel their work is really worthwhile, and so they go too far against themselves, if you get what I mean, you know, in that way. So the 5 ways are connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire. And I just want to tell a story. I was running a course, and someone I know is running a happiness MBA, she calls it, and I'm teaching the module on diagnosing and measuring happiness at work. Okay, so the data stuff. And I've got these 15 students from mainly from Portugal and Netherlands and other places. It's an interesting course. Anyway, and they're on the course, and I say to them, okay, think of a time when you were happy at work. And they basically all listed about relationships, about meaning, about challenge, empowerment. And then when I said a time when you were unhappy, it was all the fair ones that weren't being met. So it was, were you feeling respected? Were you feeling appreciated? So someone said, I felt invisible at work. Was your work-life balance out of thing? And that's, of course, a big kilter for burnout and stress, and basically, and the reason we call it fairness is it's not respecting that people have got a life outside of work, so I love that three shift challenge you did. That's great. And that she rose to it. That's really good. And so I think that what really undermines happiness, and I think leads to burnout, is probably a combination between treated unfairly and probably that passion that you've got for loving your work. And you've got both of those together. I don't know, that's kind of a bit where I think it goes. I don't know what you think, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between what you talk about in terms of getting to happiness and what I talk about with regards to what leads people to burnout. And actually, unfairness is one of the things that definitely leads to burnout. And I mentioned before that one of the symptoms that we see is that change in attitude. What I see often with people who are treated unfairly, or at least perceive the treatment that they're getting to be unfair, is that there's a huge change in their attitude and they end up becoming very resentful. I recently worked with a guy who, I guess as part of his job, really helps other people in the organization to get to be super successful in all kinds of ways. And he wasn't expecting really anything in return, but what he found was that he wasn't getting acknowledged for helping them. So they might go out and, get a paid speaking engagement as a result of him really mentoring them. And they would credit other people for helping them with all kinds of things, and his name wouldn't come up, right? Or they would have a website for their organization, and he was like really mentoring them in terms of how to raise funds or whatever it was, and his name wouldn't be mentioned. And this just kept happening over and over again. And he got to a point where he was just so resentful about not getting any sort of mention for all of the help that he'd been giving people that he was like, why should I care anymore? I'm just gonna like sit here. We talk about quiet quitting. It was like the epitome of quiet quitting. Like he just was like, this is an easy job. I don't have to do anything. I can just sit here and, get paid.
Yeah.
No one's gonna know. And so, and the thing is, I'm really not for that kind of solution, because, then you're like, okay, yeah, you might get away with not doing much, but you're so unhappy.
Yeah.
It's really not the solution, So I think when we experience things to really be unfair, it can definitely lead to a lot of burnout, and to your case, a lot of unhappiness at work, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, if you want to know how you're doing on the 5 ways, we have got a little free questionnaire you can do, which gives you a report on the 5 ways, and it will show you more about that. And Angela can put that in the chat. But I'd be great if you could put some questions in the Q&A, because Sharon is here and she is an expert on all of this stuff. So that would be great.
And Nick is here to talk about happiness, so we can. So maybe you could just mention if you want one of us to answer it, and we're also both happy to answer from both of our angles as well.
Good.
That's brilliant. So just to start off, we've got just a comment from someone saying about when you were talking earlier about sort of positivity, that they felt like you were talking about them. That's exactly the issue that they've experienced. That they're going to make it and they keep going, and that they're strong enough, and then the burnout shows up from the corner. So I think that's just someone kind of really hearing what you were saying there. And the first question that's come in is the incidence of burnout more or less correlated with introverted, extroverted personalities? I don't know if you can answer that one, Sharon.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would say introverts and extroverts burn out for different reasons. I don't know if there's statistics out there to really talk about who burns out more, but I would say definitely we think of introverts as people who burn out a lot, because when they're required to do certain tasks for their jobs, and that requires them to be more people focused, that kind of activity is very energy draining for them. And so if they're not doing enough on the back end to restore that energy, then they get depleted. Whereas with extroverts, they get energized being around other people. So for instance, if I'm a true introvert and we're doing this webinar, me speaking to all of you would be draining my energy. And if I wasn't to then do something, and especially if I was doing this sort of thing every single day, or right, then if I wasn't going to do anything to really recharge, whatever that means for me, then I am at risk for burning out over time. Whereas if Nick is a total extrovert, and right, and he's showing up, he's like, this is great, you know, I'm having a great time, and like he's getting energized being here, then he's gonna have less reason to burn out for this particular scenario. But I do think that extroverts can burn out for other reasons, and those reasons might not be in terms of the same thing that we just explained for introverts, but it might be because they're putting so much out there. Even extroverts who are getting energized doing this stuff, if they do too much, right, it's kind of like too much of a good thing. If they do too much of it, they still need that. We all need our balance, right? We need the counterpart. And if it's all just like one directional, we all end up burning out for that lack of balance. So I think there still needs to be a process of resting, relaxation, recharging, like all of that needs to happen. And we see this with people who are that go, go, go mentality of they're constantly on and then they can't turn it off. So they're trying to sleep at the end of the day and they can't fall asleep because their mind's like racing and they're like, oh my God, I got to do this, blah, 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 blah. And right. And we need to be able to just bring the energy down and then close it up for the day and be able to get to sleep and other things that we do to recharge. I think we all burn out for different reasons, but it's a great question. I love it.
And you have got me right. I'm off the scale extrovert. And I do get totally energized by stuff. And yeah, but of course I come down to, and I need hermit time. I've learned over life that I need time for my hermit as well as my whatever. Angela, in your hands, question.
Yeah, so really interesting one. Can you help people who are a potential concern of burnout, but are in denial of needing to take their foot off the pedal?
That's a really good question. And it's kind of like the whole expression of you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? So I think part of it is when we're not self-aware, you know, I think, Nick, you brought this up earlier, like sometimes we just don't know that we're burned out. So for people to reflect that can be helpful. And that can be a start of the conversation or start of our process of looking inward and saying like, wait, maybe there is something there, right? And I think, Nick, you mentioned this happened to you where you were like the last one to realize what was going on. Had somebody come up to you and said, you know, you might want to look at this. There might be some resistance at first, but, you know, enough people say something, then you're like, maybe it's me, you know, maybe there's something I need to look at. And that's really helpful. So I think the more we educate around burnout for everybody involved, the more we know what to look out for. So like, for instance, today we talked about there's these 3 symptoms that you want to be on the lookout for. So now that you have these things in your mind, if you are experiencing that and you were in that maybe category in the beginning where you were like, I think I'm burnt out, I'm not really sure, maybe, then now that you have those symptoms to look out for, you might say, actually, that does sound like me. Or no, I thought I was maybe burned out, but that's definitely doesn't describe my experience. That can help you get into a more definitive yes or no, as opposed to being in that middle of the road kind of, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, I often think of the questionnaires we ask as acting like a mirror to people, you know, that when I was young, I trained as a therapist, and my therapist used to always say to me that, therapists acts like a mirror. They reflect back what they hear. And I think of our statistics and our questionnaires as acting like a mirror. And it's why we always feedback data to the individual. And I have this hope, and I don't have it proved, and I don't know how I would do, but I would hope that by doing Friday Pulse every week, and are you happy or not this week? Basically, if you start seeing you've got lots of weeks where you're okay or a bit below, it starts making you think, what can I do? And so actually it brings you into awareness, because I think a lot of this is a bringing you into awareness process. It's
100%.
like bringing you into awareness, and when we can make better informed decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate you saying that, because I think it's whenever we have these habits in place that it allows us to really think about what's going on and be more present, be more mindful.
Yeah.
And we see the same sort of thing happening with gratitude practices, right? Where it's like forcing you to think about something to write down that night. If you're going to write something down if you give yourself that task, right? What I see happening with that is that now, if I know I'm going to have to write something down later throughout the day, I'm going to be scanning my environment and thinking like, oh, I could put that one down, right? Because I'm thinking about it. It's kind of top of mind. But if I don't have that assignment, I might experience that same positive thing and not process it, like just not even pay attention to it. So I love the fact that you guys are constantly showing up with these questions and helping people remember to pay attention to what's going on with them. And when we're being asked those same questions and noticing that we're getting suboptimal results, we can start to pay attention to what may be more helpful, what might help us to be more happier at work for whatever reasons.
Great. Angela.
Yeah, so next question, I think really follows on really nicely from the last one in terms of, how do you guide someone towards seeing that, is what's the best way to support someone coming back from burnout at work as a manager when it might have been the job or organization that led to it?
Such a good question. Yeah, and again, here it's really going to depend how much of it was the culture versus the individual, and how much of it has changed, right? A lot of times people will say, oh, I'm burned out, and they go for a vacation or they take some time off. And that's good if you're using that time to really recharge and unplug. But oftentimes people get really anxious about falling behind. And so they'll be like still checking emails and doing all these things, even when they're on vacation. And that doesn't allow them to really recharge. And if what we're saying is that people are exhausted, they really do need to unplug and not be constantly checking in and not worrying about all of the buildup. In fact, what needs to happen as an organization, what you can do is while they're still out, is get coverage for them so that they don't have to worry about it, so that when they come back, they can have that refresh. They don't have to now get caught up and be all stressed out about that, because that's not going to be helpful. So I think we can even start helping people when they're out on their leave and they're trying to get better. And then when they come back, it's really about, I think, checking in and saying, what can we do to help? Having as part of your work culture, opportunities for people to take breaks and not scheduling back-to-back meetings. It's about reminding people. So like when you do the Friday Pulse as part of your organization, I think that's what that does, Nick, to your point. It reminds people, it keeps it top of mind that I think one of the things you guys do beautifully, you talked about support as one of the factors that leads to happiness. And I think when you're asked like, hey, can you give somebody a good job, right? You're constantly thinking not about yourself, but about other people. We actually have seen the best gratitude practice isn't in terms of thinking about what you're grateful for, but how you can help other people, right? And being grateful for the happiness that you're creating in others. And so when you're putting somebody else on a pedestal, you feel good for having done that, and they get the recognition. So that's kind of a burnout prevention, because we said there's a lot of unfairness otherwise. So they're getting recognition. happen. And so that's why I'm such a big fan of Friday Pulse. I think you guys do an excellent job of really fighting a lot of the factors that can create that chronic stress otherwise.
Certainly one of our aims. I've thought of something that I wanted to say and I've forgotten I wanted to say, which is my smoker idea. I have told you this, haven't I, Sharon?
Yes.
Yeah, just because we were talking about short-term stress and things like that, I've got this idea, and some of you may have seen a video on this, but because I put one up on LinkedIn a bit ago. But if you're short-term stressed, then think what a smoker would do. Okay, and I'm not telling you to go and take up smoking. That's clearly not good for you. But smokers, it's always struck me as a non-smoker. I've always been a non-smoker. I never learned to inhale a cigarette. I obviously inhale air, but I don't do the cigarette stuff. It just always felt horrible. But anyway, but smokers are really good at dealing with short-term stress, obviously at long-term damage, but they do it. And I'm going to read it out. They stop what they're doing. They move their body, and then they go outside. And then they kickstart conversations with other people. And then a big trick with smoking is that you're concentrating on your breath. And actually what you tend to do is exhale for longer than you inhale, which is basically mindful breathing. And so those 5 things make smoke, which is, stop what you're doing, move your body, go outside, kickstart conversations, exhale for longer than you inhale, and then you relax. So smoker. And what I do think is that too often at work, we don't get up every hour and we don't move, and go outside is really good for lots and lots of reasons. And also social conversations, as you said, really, really important. And the mindful breathing is such a good way of de-stressing us. I mean, basically, it's a signal to the body that we're safe, because, if you're being in our, past, if you're being chased, you'd be breathing very fast. And as soon as you've stopped and you can afford to breathe out for longer than you breathe in, you've got to be chilled. And so you're telling your body you're chilled because you're not running, you're not running. So, it's a really good way of just de-stressing the body very quickly. So I've heard people say at variously we should exhale for twice as long as we inhale, but certainly for longer. And it really, really works. So, and we've got another 6 minutes now. So maybe one more question or something. I don't know, Angela, or wrap 2 together.
So the next question is a sort of individual one. So how does an individual with burnout address it in a workplace that says they want to address burnout and happiness, but the day-to-day culture doesn't reflect that?
That's an excellent question, and certainly can be very challenging. I think it's about knowing yourself. I think part of what happens when we burn out is that we're externally focused. And so it's like about getting the work done. It's about crossing things off our list. It's about making sure everybody's taken care of. And oftentimes we do that at our own expense. We're not really paying attention to our own needs. And that's why we're not setting boundaries, and we're really burning out, right? We're kind of like, if we go back to the example of the introvert, if you're doing all of this work that is taking energy out of you, and then you, as often people say, workout. I don't have time for meditation. I don't have time for myself, right? You're not really doing what you need to do in order to make the work sustainable. So you have to know yourself. What are your needs? And then have some boundaries in place about what you need in order to get those needs met. What do you need to have in place? What are the systems for you? Nobody at your work is responsible for you in the way that you are. So they're just there to make sure that you do what it is you need to do. And you're there to do what you need to do. But then it's your job to figure out how. And by having better self-awareness of what those needs are and what the boundaries that you need to have are, you're able to create the kinds of conditions that help you show up in a sustainable way. And that might mean that you challenge the culture, or that you say, I am willing to do this, but not that, or I can't do this today, but I can do it tomorrow. Or if you want me to do this and I have these other things on my plate, you have to, as the boss, then decide, do you want me to do A, that you're coming to me with today, over B, which you gave me last week and I'm still working on it, right? So you're kind of putting it out there of like, I only have X number of hours or however long you have, and having that idea of, I can't just because I got something else, just now cram and go faster and do everything. Like, no, I have to have some boundaries in place. And that means that maybe I am allowing somebody else who is making the decisions to prioritize, but it's up to you to bring those things up in conversation.
Yeah. Which is not always easy, but is absolutely where it ends up. You know, it's your body that's going to hold the score if you don't sort it out. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's not any different. Like if somebody asked, like a friend asked you, hey, do you want to hang out tonight after work? If you're feeling really tired, you might say to the friend, you know, I'm not feeling up for it today, maybe next week, right? It's about checking in with yourself. Like, is it okay for me to go out? Like maybe I just want to have a chill night at home, or yeah, let's do it. Let's go. And if you're saying yes to every invitation, regardless of how you're feeling, you're not going to enjoy yourself as much. And you're not taking care of yourself in the process. So I think we have to be more deliberate about the decisions that we make and think about what is the long-term outcome. If you got to be at work the next day, you know, does it make sense for me to go out tonight? Or maybe I need to, you know, take a rain check on that.
Yeah. Saying no is always an important lesson to learn in life, and we have to keep learning it. I often say that when you can say no, people believe your yes better, because it sets the boundary. Right, we need to sort of get into wrap up mode because it's 2 minutes to. Now, two things. One is that Angela's going to pop a poll questionnaire there, which is about, you know, our own, how you found this webinar and whether you would, it's just the NPS question, whether you recommend it. So if you could answer that, that'd be very grateful. But then Sharon, I think you've got an offer to people, haven't you, that you would like to make?
Yeah. So if anybody is watching this, especially if you said yes to the burnout question and you're kind of wondering, so now that I know what it is and we've talked about it, if you're ready to take the next step and you're thinking about maybe getting some coaching around this, I do offer a free consultation. I call it a dial back your stress breakthrough session. And I want to offer that free of charge to any of you who are here today listening to this and think that this might be appropriate. And what we do on this call is we go through your exact challenges of what you're facing right now, what your goals are. And then if I can help bridge the gap between those two, I will share with you what I can do to help. And we'll either way, I'll share with you my recommendations for you. So whether you end up signing up with me or not, you can walk away with a lot of value from that call. So if you're interested, the link to sign up is bookachatwithsharon.com.
Yeah, and I think you put that in the chat, haven't you, Angela?
I have. I've shared that with everyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And we'll put it in the follow-up email as well, if that's okay. Is that okay, Sharon? Because the follow-up email will go to everybody who signed up, which is bigger than here. I don't know. Maybe you want to speak with the people that actually turned up. I don't know. Well, I'll ask you afterwards about that. So thank you for answering that question. Massive thanks for you, Sharon, joining. That was well, I've been looking forward to it. And it was a delight. I've learned things about burnout actually, and in preparing for thought more about it. So thank you. We enjoyed being a partner with you. So hopefully we can carry on working together. And thank you, Angela, for managing the chat and everything.
No
Takes total pressure off and makes it very easy to just be yourself on the webinar. Wouldn't work without you.
Yeah, a huge thanks to both of you and to all of the people that attended today. And thank you for those of you who participated in the polls as well as in the chat, because it makes it interactive. And I always appreciate people who are engaged in the session.
Yeah, and if you have got any further questions for us, then I think we're both very visible on LinkedIn. You'll find us and just post us a question. So, you know, if you just want to ask us a question, please do that. And I will send a follow-up email. I don't think it'll be tomorrow. It might be just a bit later in the week, but and I'll put your LinkedIn profile in there, Sharon, if I may. Yeah. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening or morning, depending where you are in the world. It's very dark here in England now. It's been a miserable day today. It's been one of the days where the wind just blew totally. Thanks,
bye, everybody.
So much, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.